There is a particular kind of mistake that only arrogant people make. They humiliate someone in public because they are certain the room belongs to them. On Meridian Benefit night, beneath the palms and camera flashes of the Marisol Bay Hotel, Grant Hill was about to make that mistake. The Meridian Coast Benefit was not just a fundraiser. It was a ranking system in evening wear. Invitations mattered. Donor tables mattered. Being photographed near the right people mattered most of all. And at the Coral Terrace Rival Court, Grant intended to use that system exactly as it was designed. He would decide who belonged inside. He would make sure one particular woman understood that she did not. What Grant did not know was that Nia Carter held a far deeper claim to that glittering night than he ever could. Grant Hill looked like he belonged there, at 43, in a tailored midnight blue tuxedo. The CEO of Hale Hospitality Development moved through their rival line with the confidence of a man accustomed to doors opening before he reached them. Photographers called his name. Donors paused to shake his hand. Beside him, Sloan Mercer gleamed in silver beads, platinum hair catching every burst of light as if the cameras had been waiting for her. Grant enjoyed that. He enjoyed the proof. Then a pro-black sedan eased to the curb. Nia Carter stepped out alone, tall, composed, an emerald silk gown. Her natural coils swept into an elegant updo. No entourage, no performance, no visible effort to reclaim the attention Grant had spent 3 quiet years assuming she had lost. To him, that stillness looked like defeat. Sloan followed his gaze, then gave the smallest, sharpest smile. Grant stepped forward before Nia reached the glass doors. He wanted witnesses for this part. Nia, Grant said, loud enough for the people nearest the velvet ropes to hear, I don't think you're on the list. He lifted one hand toward Mateo Ruiz. The guard approached with his credential tablet already open. For a second, Mateo searched the Meridian credential roster in silence. Then he looked up, uneasy. I'm sorry, ma'am. I don't see a credential under that name. That was all Grant needed. He gave a thin smile, the kind meant to make cruelty look reasonable. Then I think it's best you leave. This is an invitation-only evening. Sloan's expression barely changed. She was enjoying herself too much. Around them, conversation softened. A few guests looked away. Others watched with the careful interest people reserve for someone else's embarrassment. Grant waited for Nia to argue, to explain, to look hurt. She did none of it. Nia simply held Mateo's gaze and said, I understand. Then she stepped back from the entrance with the same calm she had arrived with. And somehow, that silence made Grant's victory feel smaller than he expected. Grant watched Nia move away from the doors and mistook restraint for surrender. That was his first real loss of the night, because the lights glowing across the Azure Grand Salon, the sponsor banners lining the lobby, the flawless service, the money behind the Meridian Coast Benefit, none of it was there by accident. It existed because Nia Carter had made a decision long before this evening. That helped make the entire event possible. Grant had just ordered the quiet force behind the gala to leave its own threshold. Inside, guests still laughed over champagne. The jazz ensemble still played. Nobody in the ballroom understood what had happened outside. Not yet. But somewhere beyond those glass doors, the mistake had been seen, and the truth was already moving toward Grant Hale. Years earlier, before the tuxedos, the hotel deals, and the polished speeches about vision, Grant and Nia lived in a modest little Havana walk-up. Grant chased contracts by day and connections by night. Nia made those connections hold. She remembered which investor's daughter had started college, which contractor needed a call before a meeting, which potential partner had been offended, reassured, delayed, or quietly won over. She organized his calendar, repaired awkward conversations, prepared him for rooms he had not yet learned how to enter. When Grant landed a meeting, people called him ambitious. When that meeting turned into a relationship, they called him self-made. Nia stood nearby and let them say it. At first, Grant thanked her, then he expected it. Then, slowly, he began speaking as if her work had never existed at all. Their shared ambition became his success story, and Nia the woman carrying its memory, its timing, and its human cost became invisible inside her own marriage. As Grant rose, he began confusing attention with proof. The better the office became, the colder he did. In Hale Development's glass-walled Brickell suite, he learned to speak in renderings, headlines, private dinners, and names that opened doors. He started measuring people by what they reflected back at him. And then Sloan Mercer began appearing more often. At first, she was a luxury consultant with an easy smile and a camera-ready life. Then she was at lunches, then at launch parties, then in Grant's office. leaning close while he gave her a warmth Nia had not felt from him in months. Nia saw it. She did not make a scene. She did not beg him to explain what had already become clear. That was not weakness. It was the last dignity left to a woman watching her marriage become part of someone else's image campaign. When the dissolution agreement arrived, Grant handled it with the same polished efficiency he brought to a deal. Sign here, move forward, no public mess. Nia signed, and because she refused to fight for an audience, Grant got to tell the cleaner version. He implied she had struggled with his ambition, that she could not keep pace with the life he was building, that she had simply drifted away. People believed him because success tells its own flattering lies. For 3 quiet years, Nia led them. She disappeared from Grant's photographs, from his speeches, from the story he told about becoming self-made. But on the screens inside the Azure Grand Salon, among Coastline civic events sponsor history and partnership credits, her name had been appearing all evening, small, easy to miss, unless you knew where to look. Grant never did. Inside the Azure Grand Salon, Grant Hill looked like a man who had one. His midnight blue tuxedo caught the light. Investors circled close. The Latin jazz ensemble softened the room just enough for important people to sound relaxed. While discussing very expensive things, Grant was describing the Harborline Resilience District with practiced confidence. Jobs, mixed income housing, waterfront infrastructure, a future Miami could be proud of. The Bayfront Capital Circle listened as he spoke, nodding at the right moments. Across the room, Sloan checked the room the way she checked everything else, through optics. Who had arrived? Who was watching? Which camera angle made the evening look expensive enough? Then Priya Desai, standing near Grant's shoulder, asked a question he did not expect. Was that Nia Carter outside? Grant barely paused. My former wife, he said, with the casual dismissal of someone brushing lint from a sleeve. That was a long time ago. Priya's expression shifted, because some people still remembered Nia from the early years, not as an accessory, not as a former spouse, as the person who made difficult rooms easier, unstable relationships steadier, and ambitious plans feel possible. Grant did not see that memory move across their faces. He was too busy enjoying his own reflection. Sloan soon spotted Luca Voss near the bar and drifted away for photographs. Silver gown flashing beneath the ballroom lights. Grant kept talking. Behind him, the Coastline Impact Display Network rolled through sponsor logos. Leadership milestones and partnership histories, a familiar name surfaced, then disappeared, then returned on another screen across the ballroom. Nia Carter. Grant never turned around. That was the danger of believing a room belongs to you. You stop noticing what the room is trying to tell you. Outside, Nia did not leave. She stepped to the edge of the carpeted arrival lane and stood beneath the glow of the hotel lights. Emerald silk moving softly in the bay breeze. No argument. No phone call made for effect, no attempt to convince Mateo Ruiz that he had made a mistake. She had already understood something Mateo had not. The Meridian credential roster could deny a name. It could not erase a reality. Mateo kept glancing from his tablet to Nia, then back toward the glass doors. His procedural certainty was beginning to fray. Nia simply waited. Near the curb, Asha Patel remained beside the black Lucid sedan, patient and ready, as though she expected a long wait. To Grant, Nia had been sent away. To Nia, the evening had merely paused, and inside that pause, the balance of power was already changing. Then the building began to react. At first, Grant noticed only movement. A manager crossing the Palm lobby too quickly, a phone ringing unanswered near the ballroom doors. To senior staff members leaving the Seabright control suite at the same time. Faces tight, headsets alive with urgent voices. Then more followed. The Coastline senior team broke formation in plain sight. They were not greeting donors. They were not managing a seating issue. They were moving toward the entrance. Evan Cho emerged near the front of the ballroom, one hand pressed to his earpiece, his thin-rimmed glasses catching the light. He looked toward the glass doors, then hurried out as if the person he needed was already slipping away. Whispers started. Grant's investor circle noticed. So did Sloan, who lowered her phone and watched the sudden rush with a flicker of uncertainty. Grant felt something colder than embarrassment. He had told himself Nia was irrelevant, a leftover from a life he had outgrown. But irrelevant people did not make an event director run. Irrelevant people did not empty operations offices. Irrelevant people were not chased by senior executives while donors turned their heads and asked what had happened. For the first time that night, Grant looked toward the entrance and understood that he might not have removed Nia from the gala at all. He might have removed the gala from its center, and now the entire institution seemed to know it. 3 quiet years earlier, Nia Carter began again, not with a public statement, not with a bitter interview, not with the kind of spectacle Grant would have understood. She took the dissolution agreement, closed the door on the life that had erased her, and rented a small office above a flagless street shop. It was not glamorous. A narrow room, old stairs, a desk that faced a wall, and for a while, when people recognized her at all, they recognized her as Grant Hill's former wife. That was the label they gave her, the woman who had been left behind. They did not know what she had spent years learning while Grant collected praise. How to read tension before it became conflict. How to hear what powerful people were avoiding. How to build trust between people who had every reason not to trust one another. Nia knew negotiations were rarely won by the loudest person in the room. They were won by the person who understood the room before everyone else did. So she worked quietly, she listened, she studied. She took meetings no one thought were important enough to take. And while Miami's prestige circles repeated Grant's version of the divorce, Nia began building a life that did not require his name, his approval, or his invitation. They mistook her silence for an ending. It was a beginning. The first test came from a place most people had already written off. The Biscayne Community Arts Trust was drowning in debt, losing donors, and surviving on optimism nobody could put on a balance sheet. People called it a lost cause. Nia called it unfinished. For months, she studied every number, every broken promise, every partnership that had collapsed because no one had bothered to understand what the other side needed. Then she started meeting people, donors who had stopped believing, community leaders who had stopped being asked, staff members who had spent years watching polished executives make speeches about a mission they barely understood. Nia listened, and slowly, she built a coalition where everyone else had seen a ruin. She persuaded Pelican Harbor Capital to back the restructuring. She stabilized the trust, restored its programs, rebuilt trust before she rebuilt its public image. The results spoke with a clarity Grant had never learned to respect. One turnaround became another. Advisory seats followed, partnership meetings, boardrooms where people began waiting for Nia to speak, because when she did, she usually saw the problem beneath the problem, and eventually, her work brought her to coastline civic events, not as someone's former wife, not as a guest hoping to be noticed, as a major owner in the company producing the Meridian Coast benefit itself. By the time Grant Hill decided she did not belong outside those glass doors, Nia Carter had spent 3 quiet years building the kind of authority no invitation could grant. Authority earned through outcomes, authority built where nobody was looking, which was why the people inside were suddenly running. Back at the Coral Terrace arrival court, Nia watched the revolving doors spin. Then the executives came through. Several of them, their tuxedos were perfect. Their expressions were not. Nia recognized the first face immediately. Darius Okafor, Coastline Civic Events Chief Operating Officer, moved toward her with the unmistakable urgency of a man who had just learned that a small mistake was not small at all. Behind him came Helena Ward, then board members, then more anxious figures pressing through the hotel doors. The gala had finally reached the woman it had left outside, and Darius was coming fast. Darius stopped in front of Nia, visibly trying to gather himself. "Nia," he said, breathless, "I am so sorry. This should never have happened." Helena Ward stepped forward beside him, her face tight with embarrassment. "Security should not have stopped you. We are already getting questions from the Coastline Governance Board." Behind them, Marisol Vega and Thomas Okoye stood in strained silence. That was when Mateo understood the scale of what he had done. He had followed an instruction, checked a roster, enforced a denial. But the calm woman standing before him was not pleading to get into the Meridian Coast benefit. The board was asking why she had been kept out. Nia looked at Mateo for a moment. There was no anger in her face. That made it worse. He was not the architect of this humiliation. He was only the hand Grant had used to carry it out. Through the glass doors, Grant was still inside the Azure Grand Salon. Smiling at something in his investor circle, Sloan stood near him, silver gown catching the ballroom light, still unaware that the night had shifted beneath her feet. Nia followed the line of sight. Then she said, quietly, "There is no need to rush." Darius blinked. Helena looked as though she had misheard her. But Nia had not. She was not talking about the program. She was looking through the glass at Grant Hill, and for the first time, the people gathered around her understood where the real problem was waiting. Then, another car pulled up at the curb, and Darius went pale. Arthur Bellamy stepped out in a black dinner jacket, silver hair close cropped. His arrival quiet enough to make the panic around him feel even louder. The chairman of Coastline Civic Events was rarely seen at the entrance of his own events. Tonight, he did not acknowledge Darius first. He did not ask Helena for an explanation. He did not look at Mateo. He walked straight to Nia. "Nia," Arthur said, relief warming his voice. "There you are. We were waiting for you, waiting for her." Darius lowered his eyes. Arthur glanced toward the doors. "The presentation is ready. Shall we go inside?" Nia did not move immediately. Instead, she looked once more through the glass. Grant was still holding court in the ballroom, still surrounded by people, still wearing the easy confidence of a man who believed the room belonged to him. He had no idea the chairman had just come outside for the woman he had tried to leave at the curb. Nia let that moment breathe. Then she gave Arthur a small nod, and together, they turned toward the doors. Inside the Azure Grand Salon, Grant felt the room changing before he understood why. Conversations kept breaking apart. Guests glanced toward the Palm lobby, then checked their phones. Investors who had been listening to Grant's Harborline Resilience District pitch drifted away mid-sentence. Drawn by some disturbance he could not see, Sloan noticed it too. "What is happening?" she asked, looking down at her screen, then back toward the entrance. Grant gave her the answer he wanted to believe. Probably a logistics issue, but even he did not sound convinced. Darius came back through the ballroom doors at a sharp pace. His composure gone around the edges, he crossed directly to Marisol Vega and Thomas O'Coy, speaking low and fast. Whatever he said made both board members turn toward the entrance. Not casually, immediately, Grant watched them, a hard pressure gathering beneath his ribs. This was not a seating problem. It was not a late donor. Something outside had reached inside the Gala and pulled the room's attention away from him. Around Grant, the investor circle thinned, and for the first time all evening, he was no longer controlling the conversation. He was waiting for an explanation, one he was beginning to fear had his former wife's name on it. Then Caleb Mars stopped looking at Grant. He was looking at the screens. Across the Azure Grand Salon, the Coastline Impact Display Network had shifted into a polished feature on Coastline Civic Events. Recent growth, donor partnerships, expanded programming, new civic investments, and there, between the numbers and photographs, was Nia. Again, Nia beside community leaders, Nia in a boardroom, Nia standing beneath the Coastline logo as executives gathered around her. Grant stared at the images as if the screens had made a mistake. They had not. Caleb followed his gaze, then gave a quiet, impressed smile. "Nia Carter," he said, "remarkable woman, honestly. A lot of the people in this room would not be here without her." The words landed softly. That was what made them worse. Not an accusation, not gossip, just common knowledge Grant had somehow missed. Caleb turned back to him. "You know her?" For 1 second, Grant could not answer. His former wife had not disappeared after the divorce. She had been building something, and apparently everyone but him had known. Then the ballroom doors opened. The sound of conversation thinned. Arthur Bellamy entered first, but he was not alone. Nia walked beside him in emerald silk, composed and unhurried, as though she had not been standing outside the same hotel minutes earlier while Grant decided she did not belong. Arthur did not drift toward the donors waiting to greet him. He stayed beside her. That detail traveled through the room faster than a formal introduction ever could. Dr. Rafael Mendoza broke from a conversation near the windows and crossed the floor to welcome Nia personally. Jake Kim stepped away from a group of founders to do the same. Leila and Omar Hassan smiled warmly as Nia passed, the kind of greeting reserved for someone whose calls got returned. Sloan's expression changed, not all at once. First confusion, then disbelief. Grant felt the investor circle around him go still, because the room was no longer asking who Nia Carter was. The room was showing him, near the stage. Darius leaned close to Camille Lauren and spoke in a low, urgent voice. Camille nodded once. Behind her, the production crew began moving with sudden purpose, adjusting screens, changing cues, rewriting the meridian run of show in plain sight. The program itself was making room for Nia, and Grant could only watch as the woman he had tried to leave at the curb entered, like the evening had been waiting for her all along. Camille stepped to the microphone before the next scheduled presentation could begin. "Before we continue," she said, her voice carrying across the Azure Grand Salon, "we have someone whose leadership deserves to be recognized." The screens changed again. Growth charts rose across the Coastline Impact Display Network. Revenue, partnerships, expanded programs. Then the numbers gave way to a full-screen image of Nia. The ballroom began to applaud. Camille spoke over it. 3 years ago, Coastline civic events faced a difficult future. Today, it's growth, it's partnerships, and much of what this benefit has become reflect the strategic leadership of Nia Carter. Grant did not move. Neither did Sloan. Camille continued, "Nia is not simply one of our most trusted advisors. She is a major shareholder in Coastline civic events." That was the moment the last private story Grant had told himself collapsed. Nia had not been struggling in some forgotten office after the marriage ended. She had been acquiring ownership, building influence, changing the very company producing the Gala Grant had treated like his personal stage. Around him, Marisol and Thomas applauded with the rest of the board. The investor circle rose to its feet, and Grant stood frozen beside Sloan, forced to listen as the room gave Nia the credit he had spent years assuming she would never earn without him. But the applause was not the real blow that came next. The screen shifted from Coastline's history to a timeline of civic partnerships and major projects. Names appeared in clean white type. Then Grant saw one he knew too well. Hale Hospitality Development, his company. Below it came another name, the Harbor Civic Growth Fund. Grant's throat tightened. Camille explained that the fund supported long-term community partnerships, workforce programs, resilient development, the kind of capital that decided whether ambitious projects became reality or remained expensive renderings in executive offices. Then she said it, and Nia Carter serves as chair of the Harbor Civic Advisory Council. For a second, Grant heard nothing else. Harbor Line. His Harbor Line Resilience District needed financing from that fund. Jobs, mixed-income housing, waterfront infrastructure. The flagship deal he had been selling all evening depended on a network Nia now helped oversee. The investors around him understood it too. Their applause rose, but their eyes moved toward Grant. Not warmly, carefully, Sloan looked at him, searching his face for an explanation he did not have. Grant had wanted Nia's recognition to be symbolic, a flattering title, a donor's applause, something he could survive with a smile. Instead, the woman he had dismissed at the entrance had become connected to the decision path, beneath the largest project in his company, and every person who mattered was watching him realize it. Arthur Bellamy took the microphone. The applause softened. He looked across the ballroom, then toward Nia. "There are people who understand visibility," Arthur said, "and there are people who understand impact." The room listened. Visibility can fill a room for one night. Impact changes what remains after the room is empty. Grant felt the words find him before anyone had to look his way. For years, he had measured worth through cameras, invitations, headlines, proximity, who entered through which door, who stood beside whom, who was seen. Arthur was naming a different kind of power, the kind Grant had benefited from before he ever learned to recognize it. "Nia," Arthur said, extending a hand toward the stage. "Would you join us?" Nia walked forward without hesitation. No triumphant smile, no glance toward Grant, no need to expose what had happened outside. That restraint made it sharper. As she stepped into the light, dozens of eyes drifted toward Grant and Sloan. Sloan lowered her gaze. Grant could not. He watched Nia take the stage, and for the first time that night, humiliation gave way to something heavier, regret, because he was finally beginning to understand that Nia had never needed the room to prove her worth. The room had needed her. Nia accepted the microphone and let the applause settle. Grant braced himself. This was the moment, he thought. The entrance, the guest list, the cameras, security keeping Nia outside, one sentence from her, and the room would know exactly what he had done. But Nia only looked across the ballroom. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was calm, certain. She thanked the donors, the organizers, the artists, the neighborhood leaders, the people who had spent years doing difficult work without expecting their names in lights. Then she spoke about second chances, not as charity, as possibility, about what could happen when institutions stopped asking who looked important and started asking who was willing to build something lasting. Grant stood very still. She did not mention him. did not mention their marriage, did not mention the humiliation waiting outside the glass doors. And somehow, that was worse, because Nia did not need to make Grant the villain of her story. She had already outgrown the part he had assigned himself in it. Nia continued. She spoke of scholarships that changed a child's path before anyone else could see it, of community partnerships that took patience, of projects built not for one quarterly report, but for the people who would live with their consequences for decades. The screens behind her shifted through images of shoreline classrooms, workforce programs, neighborhood meetings. Grant watched her with a tightening in his chest. Years ago, he had mistaken this quality in Nia for softness. Her ability to listen, to remember names, to see the person behind the transaction. He had never understood that it was strategy, real strategy. Then Nia paused. Her eyes moved briefly toward Arthur Bellamy. The next image began to form across the coastline impact display network. A waterfront skyline, green corridors, elevated walkways, mixed income homes beside resilient infrastructure. Grant knew that image before it fully appeared, Harbor Line, and suddenly, the entire ballroom seemed to lean toward the screen. The rendering filled the room, the Harbor Line Resilience District, Hale Hospitality Development's largest active proposal. Grant had spent months presenting it in private meetings, polished decks and closed-door investor calls, but now it stood 30 feet high behind Nia. No longer a controlled sales pitch, now it belonged to the room. Murmurs moved through the ballroom. The Bayfront Capital Circle straightened almost at once. They knew the numbers. They knew the financing gap. They knew how much outside civic capital Harbor Line still required. Before any of those gleaming promises could become concrete, Grant tried to keep his expression neutral, but Nia had chosen the image. Nia had chosen the moment, and every eye that mattered was beginning to understand that his future had just appeared on her screen. Nia turned toward the rendering. The Harbor Line Resilience District, she said, has the potential to create meaningful jobs, expand mixed-income housing, and strengthen this city's waterfront for the years ahead. Grant felt something inside him loosen. There was praise, public praise, from the chair of the advisory council connected to the fund his project needed. For one dangerous second, he let himself believe this was going somewhere else. Maybe Nia had decided to rise above the past in a way that would help him. Maybe this was the beginning of an announcement, a signal to the investors, a quiet assurance that Harbor Line had cleared the final hurdle. He almost breathed again. Around him, the investors listened with renewed interest. Grant fixed his eyes on Nia, waiting for the sentence that might save his deal. He did not yet understand that praise was not approval, and Nia was not finished speaking. But potential, Nia said, is only the beginning. The ballroom went quiet. The Harbor Civic Growth Fund is still conducting its final review. Grant's brief relief vanished. Nia spoke with the same measured calm she had used all evening. Funding, she explained, required more than attractive projections and strong financial models. It required responsible leadership, sound judgment, partners who understood that public trust was not a line item to manage after the deal closed. Each word landed cleanly. No accusation, no name. That was the precision of it. Grant heard the entrance in every phrase anyway. Leadership, judgment, public trust. The Bayfront Capital Circle exchanged glances, not dramatic ones. Worse, professional ones. They knew Hale Hospitality Development was under review, and now they knew exactly what the review would measure beyond the spreadsheets. Nia looked across the room, composed beneath the stage lights. Our recommendation will be made soon, she said, and it will be made fairly. Fairly? Grant had tried to keep her outside because he thought she did not belong inside. Now his company's most important project sat within a process she helped lead. The applause returned slowly, but Grant barely heard it. He was no longer wondering whether Nia had the power to hurt him. He was beginning to understand that she had something far more unnerving, the power to judge him fairly. The applause faded, but the room did not move on. It moved toward Nia. Community leaders closed around her before she had fully stepped away from the stage. Hands reached out. Questions followed. People wanted her thoughts, her time, a few minutes of her attention. The woman Grant had tried to leave outside was suddenly the hardest person in the Azure Grand Salon to reach, and Grant stood still for one beat too long. Then he left the investor circle. Sloan called after him, confused, but he barely heard her. He crossed the ballroom through conversations that had changed shape around him. Nia was already turning toward the tall windows overlooking the city when he reached her. Nia, he said, She looked at him, not warmly, not coldly, simply waiting. Can we talk for years? Grant had assumed access to her was something he possessed. A call answered, a problem handled, a presence waiting in the background of his life. Now he was asking, and she was deciding. After a moment, Nia gave a small nod and walked toward the quieter space by the windows. Grant followed, not beside her, behind her. Beyond the ballroom noise, Miami stretched beneath the glass in thousands of lights. Grant looked at Nia and realized he did not know where to begin. Not really. I didn't know, he finally said, about coastline civic events, about the Harbor Civic Growth Fund, any of it. Nia said nothing, so he kept going. I made mistakes. Grant said, I should have checked on you. I should have treated you differently. The words sounded smaller once they were spoken aloud. He swallowed. I guess I always thought you would need me. That was the truth beneath all the polished versions of his past. Nia held his gaze. No, she said quietly, you spent years trying to prove that I did. Grant went still. You were so busy needing me to depend on you. Nia continued, that you never noticed how much I was already helping you. There was no anger in her voice. That made it worse. No raised voice. No list of grievances. No effort to make him hurt. Just accuracy. And suddenly Grant understood that his ignorance had not begun tonight. In a ballroom full of screens and investors, it had begun years ago, when he mistook her quiet strength for a lack of it. Grant wanted to argue, not because she was wrong, because she was right. The memories came back with brutal clarity. Nia making introductions he had later treated as his own connections. Nia remembering names, smoothing tensions, keeping relationships alive after he had already moved on to the next deal. Nia seeing opportunities before he did, then stepping aside while he accepted the credit. Their early Brickle years had not been a story of Grant building alone. They had been a story of Nia helping him build while he practiced believing he did not need help. I don't expect you to forgive me, he said. Nia's expression did not change. I know, she said. That was all. No promise, no comfort, no invitation to explain himself further. The silence that followed belonged to Grant alone. For the first time that night, perhaps for the first time in years, he had nowhere to place the blame except where it belonged, with himself. Grant looked back toward the ballroom, then back at Nia. What happens to Harbor Line? He asked. There it was, the question beneath every other question. Nia did not hesitate. The Harbor Civic Growth Fund will evaluate it fairly, she said. Grant searched her face for resentment, for satisfaction, for some private wound he could name and bargain against. He found none. That was the final humiliation. She was not going to use the project to punish him, as she was not going to use the past to save him. The decision would be made on leadership, judgment, and the public trust his company had to earn. Nothing more, nothing less. I'm sorry, Grant said. This time, there was no audience to impress, no investor circle to reassure, no camera waiting for the right angle, only the woman he had failed to see. Nia gave the smallest nod. I understand, she said softly. Not forgiveness, not reconciliation, just acknowledgement. Then she turned toward the ballroom, leaving Grant beside the windows with the city glittering below, and the consequences of his own story finally clear. Nia stepped back into the Azure Grand Salon, and the room opened for her. The community leaders found her almost immediately, resuming their questions as though the conversation had only paused for a breath. Someone reached for her hand. Someone else leaned in, asking for her view on a partnership. Nia answered with the same calm focus she had carried all night. No performance, no victory lap, just belonging. Grant remained near the windows, watching the ballroom reclaim her. Once, he had believed Nia's place in the world depended on whether he made room for her. Now the night had answered him. It never had. Grant stood alone beside the windows. Behind him, the Meridian Coast benefit continued around Nia. Not because she had worn the right gown, not because she had found the right camera, and not because anyone had finally given her permission to belong. Nia had built something no invitation could grant and no humiliation could take away. Trust, judgment, a life of her own. Grant had spent years chasing the appearance of importance. Nia had become important when no one was looking, and by the time he understood her worth, she no longer needed him to see it. That was what he had lost. Not a place beside her, the chance to value her before it was too late.